Welcome. I'm Rita Deverell. David Schatzky begins the next 4 hours with a provocative analysis of the events of the day on news, not exactly what it seems. Then from the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Canada, Christian Lifestyle magazine probes contemporary issues and meets people who make a difference. After that, The Cutting Edge begins a 3-part series on parenting, an activity of universal importance. This week, The Boy Who Turned Off is the thought-provoking story of one family's attempt to deal with an autistic child. Finally, Part 5 of The War Years. This episode concludes the series by outlining Hitler's defeat in Russia, the street battles of the French resistance, and the final surrender of Germany. The world from a personal and a global perspective. That's the next 4 hours on Vision. Stay tuned now for news, not exactly what it seems, with David Schatzky.
The following program is partially paid for in the public interest by Anglican Video, Ethical Growth Fund, Canadian Jesuits, the George Cedric Metcalf Foundation, and the University of Toronto. Accommodations provided by the new Sheridan Parkway Convention and Meeting Hotel at Highway 7 and 404.
Welcome to this week's edition of News Not Exactly What It Seems. I'm David Schatzky. Every week on this program, we discuss the most topical events in the news, and we try to approach the news from a social, ethical, or philosophical point of view, with a perspective and insights that go beyond the headlines. On this week's program, old concepts, new ideas, making sense of confusion. Apartheid is dead.
Sanctions were imposed to help us end the apartheid system.
Earlier this week, the South African Parliament heard that the laws separating the population according to racial groups were rescinded. Those laws gave rights to the white minority and not the black majority. South African blacks were jubilant. But Nelson Mandela's African National Congress warned that in reality, racial inequality is far from over. Meanwhile, the war in the Persian Gulf hit the ground. Despite modern technology, the battle has come down to foot soldiers fighting for inches of territory, the same way wars have been fought for centuries.
Done until the invader is out of Kuwait, and that may well be where you come in.
Though the Cold War has fizzled and apartheid is sputtering, racism, hatred, and war are still with us. Thinkers of the world grapple with the challenge of how the world works, but the more things change, the more they seem to stay the same. Well, with me today are 3 people who've thought a lot about how the ideas of the world are evolving. John O'Neill is a social theorist at York University. He's the president of the Toronto Semiotic Circle. His next book, Plato's Cave, will be published soon. Julian Patrick is coordinator of the Literary Studies program at the University of Toronto. And Julia Emberley is a feminist literary critic. She teaches literary theory at York University's English department. Well, I want to start off by talking about the confusion that I think a lot of us feel with the way the world is changing so rapidly. Some things seem like improvements, some things seem like a step back, and there's the whole interaction of the actual events and the ideas that surround them. And I'm wondering if the ideas that academics, that intellectuals have, actually help clarify the situation for us. John, is the ferment of ideas helpful in this process, or does it just add to the confusion?
Well, I think the way academics clarify ideas doesn't have much effect on the general level of consumption of ideas. The paradox is that what you call the confusion is produced by an enormous effort to simplify things, where what happens is we don't have control of what's left out and what's put in. And so as we watch an account of something, or even if we go into a supermarket, or if we pick up a high school textbook which has been simplified and made clear, we in fact find it puzzling. The whole shopping, schooling, watching the news experience very, very puzzling, because the agenda is not the one we necessarily would have thought of.
You mean it isn't adequate to explain the reality?
No, I think complex ideas would make you, if given their time, would make people much more comfortable than do simple ideas which hit you like a punch and leave you reeling with their simplicity. In fact, almost sick to your stomach with their simplicity. They don't make you understand things, and they don't make you, feel better either.
Well, Julia, do you find that there is a particular theory or point of view, old or new, that helps you understand the world?
Well, I think what I'm struggling with right now is feminism, and trying to look at the world and develop an understanding of the world through feminist theory. And I think that John is right, that feminist theory, it had a lot of immediate concerns. Feminism had a lot of immediate concerns in the 60s and 70s. It's now worked very hard to develop complex theoretical positions in order to understand the complexity of gender and gender relations in relation to things like racism and colonialism, that we do need a much more complex theory to understand gender.
And gender is that important that it influences world events?
Sure, it has become a very important determination in the world. How you get from gender to world events, again, is a giant leap. It's a very hard thing to focus on.
Maybe as this program progresses, we can try to tackle it a bit. Well, Julian, are you comforted by some ideas, old or new, when you try to figure out what's going on in the world and if things are really getting better or worse?
I don't think I'm comforted, but although it's true what John said about ideas being extremely complex, they do have their practical applications. For instance, postmodernism, post-structuralism, the various posts that are around, are really, in a way, ways of analyzing stories. And they're ways of making you skeptical about the stories that you're told, particularly the stories that the media tells you about, say, the beginning of the war.
Well, how would you take one of the post theories and apply it to the war reporting?
Well, almost all the post theories, especially postmodernism and post-structuralism, is, as I just said, a kind of skepticism about stories. And we're all told a story about the beginning of the Iraqi war, as if it began on August the 2nd with the invasion of Kuwait. But if you roll that story just a little earlier, and you go into the history of the American-Iraqi relations, and you start to tell the story, say, from about 1975, when Iraq invaded the Arabic-speaking parts of Iran, and with American assent, then you see a very, very different story indeed. And it's the sense that stories aren't total structures, that they are made up of fragments, which would be a practical application of many of the aspects of postmodernism.
In that difference between where the story started earlier, if not really, but at least earlier than it's said to start, once you pick up that difference, that's the place in which a great deal of the confusion is created about what this war could possibly be about. How could we be fighting with somebody who is now seen as a fiendish enemy outside of humanity, whom earlier, and you run the story a little bit further back, was a friend of ours being armed by us against another fiendish enemy of ours. So the confusion is locatable in the way the story is lengthened or shortened.
Now, there seems to be a couple of aspects to this. On one hand, we're talking about confusion, which has to do with understanding something, and then there's what one does when one has understanding, which perhaps is to try to make the world a better place. And I wonder if that's where feminism comes in. Does a feminist understanding of the world lead you to want to change things and make things happen in a different way?
Sure. You know, that is the basis of feminism, is to challenge the intolerable hierarchies that we live with, you know, sexism and racism and colonialism.
But that seems absolutely counter to the traditions of academic inquiry over the centuries, that academic inquiries are somehow detached and were simply for understanding, you know, knowledge for its own sake. Does that put you in direct conflict then with traditional ways of looking at the world in universities?
I think so. It's certainly the case that feminism is something that has developed over the last 20 years, that it has brought new perspective to literary studies, that it has challenged the canon of, you know, dead white European men that we've been reading and learning from. It does challenge the system. I'm not sure it's a conflict, though, there isn't conflict in academia all the time, and that conflict is productive as well.
Your next book is about Plato. I think maybe what Julia has said is that Plato isn't as relevant to her as it is to you.
Well, feminists think of Plato as perhaps the founder of their troubles. But I think if I could speak as a scholar with respect to the matter of confusion, a scholar's paid, as it were, to go into the cave, to get thoroughly acquainted with the confusion, with evil, with exploitation, with sexism, and requires a peculiar endurance. They've got to really look at these things without getting quite ill or going mad. But there's a further stage. There's some hope that by further study, further thought, one could see how it is we do these things to oneself. Now, in that stage, the hope that we might do something about things is pictured as looking directly into the sun, whether that be the sun or God's face, and then turning back in the light of that vision to try to rework the troubles of the world.
Well,
but often that turn is difficult to make, and one doesn't get back.
At this point, let's take a moment and think about the troubles of the world and some of the most powerful ideas, old and new, and talk some more as News Not Exactly What It Seems continues.
I remember when I had my first baby, and the final joy was knowing my baby was healthy. They just weighed him and measured him, and after they let me hold him, they took him to the nursery and put him in Pampers.
Over the past 20 years, Canadian hospitals have given more newborns a drier start in life with Pampers than with any other diaper.
My baby, a beautiful little baby.
Ultra Pampers Plus, all the dryness a mother or father can give right from the start.
Seeds to grow mean food to eat. Skills to learn mean more productive lives. The hands of development work for all of us, because strengthening the world's poor means strengthening the world. We are the Anglican Church.
Welcome back to News Not Exactly What It Seems. I'm David Schatzky, and with me are John O'Neill, a social theorist at York University, Julian Patrick is coordinator of the Literary Studies program at the University of Toronto, and Julia Emberley is a feminist literary critic. She teaches literary theory in York University's English department. Well, Julian, we were talking before the break about the struggles of the world, and one of the big ones, which on the surface seems to be coming to an end, is apartheid in South Africa. How do you take a postmodern view of that situation to clarify or understand what's really going on?
The rolling back of the pillars of apartheid that de Klerk has just announced on the 1st of February 1991 a year later than the 2nd of February 1990, if you remember, when he unbanned the ANC, are just the first 2 stages in a very, very long process. I suppose it's typical that the next stages haven't been properly reported. They are the freeing of the political prisoners, especially, and the whole question of whether or not there's going to be a constituent assembly brought together to make a new constitution, because the suspending of the racial typing of people at birth, on their birth certificates. You know that every South African has a birth certificate which not only says they're white or black, but what their parents were. That has direct constitutional implications, because the whole Constitution is based on such racial typing. That's an indication of the difficulty that lies ahead. And perhaps like Russia over the last 4 years, it's the easy things that come first and the hard things that come second.
Now, what you've just said to me could have come from the mouth of a political scientist or a historian, and I'm wondering, is there a specific literary theory or a literary thinker or a philosopher who has helped you come to this way of analyzing things, or have you just used regular common sense to say, hey, there's a body of things that have to be considered, and I'm considering them?
What I said was certainly straight out of common sense, straight out of yesterday's newspaper. But I guess that one sense of racism, of the indelibility of racism, the deep structural permanence of racism, that a lot of modern thought, especially the thought of, say, somebody like Derrida, for instance, leads you to recognize how deeply involved in all our discourse are racist concepts, and how very, very difficult it is to think beyond racial opposition.
You're very pessimistic. You talk about the indelibility of racism. It makes me wonder if you think that anything will ever change.
I'm not sure how exactly to answer that. The ideas that we have to answer that with don't really help us with in a way, with dramatic new events, like the changing of apartheid, like this. I think it is very difficult to predict the future on the basis of clarified ideas in the past.
Well, you know, I think racism is a good example of an old idea that ought always to be new. I mean, one would have thought that the end of racism, for which people have, certainly in the last 2 centuries, dreamed of in a certain way, would be realizable. The sad thing is that the very societies that have that dream have imposed other forms of commercial and scientific and technical racism over these societies.
Now, what do you mean by that? Could you give an example?
The whole matter of the Mandela experience, which now competes for media time with the high-tech racist war against Iraq, which has its own racism built in it, in the sense that the American army uses blacks, low-class whites. It's creamed up with white professionals on the pilot end. There has to be some white bodies there, but middle-class white bodies are missing, and that's holding up the anti-war movement, I think. They're still corralled in the universities, but it requires some sort of more broad mobilization to get them going.
It's interesting, too, that some of those bodies are now women's bodies, and that there has been a whole discussion about what it means to have women in the war. And when a woman was captured by the Iraqis, there was this sort of specter of concern about what it would mean to have an American woman to be a prisoner of war by the Iraqis.
Well, there you see, Lyotard made this curious challenge to the feminists that they would never be equal until they were in an army fighting. Of course, the Israelis have had women mobilized for a long time.
Well, there's been numerous
that.
Historical examples of women and militancy
and
women
Mohawk,
warriors.
I mean, at Oka, it was clear that while the women were not the fighters, they were nevertheless the managers.
I wonder if that's perhaps a feminist nightmare, and that many people say that if women had the power they ought to have and had more equality, then wars and conflict
they could have equal access to more violence than they already have.
That's, well, and in fact, I mean, the wish, the hope I had thought of the feminist movement was that that kind of conflict would fade away. But what we're seeing is that one of the stages appears to be that women have to get directly involved in conflict in the same way that men have traditionally in order to...
I think that's part of the problem, is that there has been an immediate reaction to certain concerns and an immediate desire for a so-called kind of equality within the existing system, and that's been perceived as progressive or a new form of social justice. But what we're getting is a desire for equality within an existing system that is already just indelibly, structurally racist and sexist. The system is structurally a problem.
Is that perhaps why feminism is maybe not just a school of thought, but is in fact a movement, and that for an idea to have real influence, it has to become part of a movement as opposed to being something that is studied or institutionalized? I don't know.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I'd agree with that. I think that many of us watching the war, which is after all a year later than the Montreal Massacre, speaking in terms of years, would find ourselves, because of the feminist movement, able to make a connection between Marc Lépin's military assault on women, and with all its paramilitary trappings, and the way in which the media, in covering the Iraqi war, have got us to sort of follow the violence in roughly the same kind of way, to think of the violence as a kind of projected assault in very similar ways on a defenseless body.
See, I think the trouble is for feminism, or as for racism, but for feminism, is to try to keep the movement all on one level when in fact it has several levels. What I mean is this, that if you might say on a rational level, one could imagine, as from the time of Plato, societies in which women played equal part with regard to guardian duties and philosophy and so on. On a libidinal level, people have thought that it would be lovely if women could be flower in the sense of taking their male side as much as their female side, this complemented by a release of the female side in the male side. And then, but then at an unconscious level, we have mythologies where what we have done is we've sunk a memory of a time when women hunted men, and that was turned into a reverse chase of men hunting women.
At that point, let's take another pause, and we'll continue with news, not exactly what it seems, in just a few moments from now.
Up here, Dad!
Would she rent the penthouse?
It's only 4 blocks from school.
And it's miles away from clean.
Ew. Good thing we brought some muscle.
Hey, the big bald guy.
With biodegradable surfactants, Mr. Clean doesn't just cut through tough, grimy dirt. He cleans right down to the shine.
Mr. Clean, Mr. Clean.
Bright kitchen.
Bright girl.
Don't just clean it, Mr. Clean it to the shine. Try EnviroPack refills.
I'm not the kind of guy to mess with my hair, and I'm sure not going to mess with shampoo and conditioner. So I found an easy way to get my hair the way I want it, with Pert Plus. It's simple. It's complete shampoo plus complete conditioner in one bottle. I just wash my hair, and Pert Plus leaves it clean, conditioned, and easy to manage. So you don't need 2 bottles of stuff. With Pert Plus, you just wash and go.
Pert Plus cleans and conditions in just one step.
I can't believe it. I just married a morning person.
The crisp scent opens your eyes. Coast, your spirits start to rise. Coast is the way to bring you back to life.
The scent awakens your senses.
Hey, the honeymoon's not over.
Coast brings you back to life.
Welcome back to News Not Exactly What It Seems. Well, we've been talking about the relationship of old ideas, new ideas, and the realities of the world around us. Is there a last word you have on that?
Well, I would say one of the extraordinary things we're seeing with regard to the Iraqi war is a new version of an old idea, namely the erasure of death through a video war that makes the death at the end of it absolutely unseeable and unexperienceable. And in other civilizations, the thinking away of death was always handled by religions as in terms of the notion of a next life or recycling. Now, I think America is a deadly society because it has no concept of death. And the two places where that deathlessness is practiced is in American medicine and in American war and American racism. There's nobody at the other end of those practices. They're in so much in love with that idea that when they kill themselves with it, they call it friendly, what is the expression?
Friendly fire.
Friendly fire. It's an extraordinary, that's a greater commitment to a bad idea than is Holy Communion, in my opinion.
You've said a lot. Julia, something you
What
want to
can
add
one
from a
say?
feminist perspective, maybe perhaps about the war?
Yeah, I think the flip side to what John is saying is also that because if there is an erasure of death, there is also the erasure of life, and there's the erasure of women. And I think what's happening is women's bodies are being used in this war in a very deadly way, to call the war, as Saddam Hussein does, as the mother of all battles. What does that mean? You know, why is it woman's body, the mother's body, is being used here to describe something as deadly and destructive as war?
Yes.
That is something to think about. Julian?
David, I think one of the things that we can say is that not only is death erased, but also injury, the maiming of bodies is erased, as groups like Philosophers for Peace have in their press release recently have suggested. The body is almost entirely taken out of this war. And the title of this program, News Not Exactly What It Seems, suggests to me that what we desperately need are alternative sources of news, that the search for alternative sources of news is really right now a matter of life and death.
Yes. The horror is that the body bags will be seen in this war. And last night, in a little program about the language usage in the war, they now have another term than body bag. It's something like human remains containers.
Mm.
So
Containers.
That's erasure again.
Well, at this point,
HRC.
at this point, we have to contain the discussion. I'm sorry that that's all the time we have this week on News Not Exactly What It Seems. I want to thank our guests on today's program. John O'Neill is a social theorist at York University. He's the president of the Toronto Semiotic Circle. His next book, Plato's Cave, will be published soon. Julian Patrick is coordinator of the Literary Studies program at the University of Toronto. And Julia Emberley is a feminist literary critic. She teaches literary theory at York University's English department. I'm David Schatzky. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.
Journalist and author Tom Harper probes the heights and depths of the human condition with a fascinating array of guests on Harper's Heaven and Hell, Fridays, and only on Vision. Christian Lifestyle magazine is presented by the Seventh-day Adventist Church in